to begin conversations around societal healing and social justice with land acknowledgement. And I also want to really honor the reality that acknowledgement alone can be really insufficient for the depth of the pain and trauma that we're actually talking about when we're acknowledging land. And so I want to make space for that later. Oh, sorry, hang on one second. I'm hearing my own echo. Let me close that. Okay, there we go. So I want to make space for that later in this conversation when we can actually dive into it more deeply and talk about what it actually looks like to live in the reality of this knowing. So with that, I'd like to bring in our guests here, and you can please feel free to introduce yourselves however you want to. But 2 prompts that I'll just offer as ideas is to share a little bit of the lineage of what brought you into your work and how you came into it, and also what you found that the work that you do has taught you about yourself. And I will start, I'll just share a little bit about myself just to bring myself in too. I found that a lot of my early learning came from growing up in a family that was, I would say, traumatized by both the Cultural Revolution and also by the Great Leap Forward in China. And I think that through all the stories that I grew up with, it became really clear to me that it's really possible for a society to spend decades fighting for what it thinks it wants and actually coming out the other end not necessarily better off and possibly farther away from its goal. And so I think that that conditioning has led me to always ask like the deeper question and always want to know if we're really going in the direction that we want and that we intend. So that is part of what brings me into my interest in healing work. So with that, I would like to open up the space. And since I have a sense that everybody here has a lot of skills in just hearing for when it's your turn to speak, I'm not going to necessarily call on folks, but just ask you to listen in for the flow of conversation and bring yourselves in.
I am muted. Okay, cool. I'm in. My name is Tada. I'm residing currently on unceded Coast Salish territories, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. It's also so-called Vancouver, BC. I'm a, what some folks might call hyphenated Canadian, so Japanese Canadian. And Japanese is pretty complex. It's we're actually a mixed race of people, like most people are actually. Colonial settler people from what we call now mainland China, and then also indigenous people to what is now called the islands of Japan. And the important context there is that there's still people who are indigenous to Japan that are fighting for their language about 2,000-3,000 years after kind of the colonial project started there. And actually the imperial Japanese government itself was established as a central government to quell the northern and southern tips of the island, which are the most indigenous. So that's like what's now called Hokkaido, which was recently annexed, and then also Okinawa, that was both recent. And both of those have traditions with their own languages, and have indigenous culture still. Yeah, and are part of the global kind of resurgence movement. So just wanted to give a little bit of context if we're talking about things like land and colonialism. The context for us, even as people of color, where we come from, we don't actually. Yeah, it's a lot more complex than talking simply about whiteness. There's long histories of imperialism in many places, and I think it's just like an interesting point. So just wanted to offer that. I guess the main lineage of work I work in, I don't know if I guess it's a lineage. It's hard to say. It's a little bit of a mycelial network, but something that we've been calling cultural somatics. And essentially that started off with kind of maybe saying that there's a dance that's happening and a lot of people are dancing, and I was like, oh, why don't we call this dance this thing? You know, and a lot of the, I'm a street dancer, so I do a dance style called poppin', and you know, a lot of the early names that were given to the dances, there was different names like boogalooing or strutting, and it comes from actually Oakland, California, and then also, you know, the rest of the, you know, Turtle Island West Coast down there. But, you know, like people would just say, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. And then over time it becomes formed into something. And then, you know, there's this period then where poppin becomes a product, which, you know, which is always an uncomfortable thing, that line where emergence crosses over into product and appropriation. So, but, you know, so that's kind of the complexity I hold the word cultural semantics with. But in my practice, it really, for me, started by looking at how do we understand this individual and collective change thing as a almost completely somatic practice. So I was getting exhausted of, yeah, conversations around social change that were not embedded within my ancestral culture. So, you know, my references for my work are, you know, obviously, you know, Asian so-called energy medicines, so martial arts, although I'm not a martial artist, and but energy medicine, martial arts, and Asian somatics in general. So understanding the world as a ever-flowing field of flux and yin and yang, and just really seeing, oh, oppression is actually happening within a body, so a cultural body. So that's kind of where the term for cultural somatics came from for me, and obviously also independently of me, you know, Resman Menakem, you know, was using that term independently of me, I think a few years before me, actually. So yeah, so that's my lineage of work, and yeah, it's really about anchoring into my ancestry and looking at social change as like a somatic practice that happens to a body, if that makes sense. As culture is a body, as the great Taoists probably would have all said. So that's kind of where, yeah, my broad lineages are. Thank you. And excited to be with you all today. There's a lot of, yeah, other than Brian, it's actually first time encounter with everybody. So really excited to be here. Thank you very much, and really honored.
Thank you.
I can share next. I'm someone who's not uncomfortable with silence, but I know sometimes in our culture there's a lot of awkwardness around silence. Like, oh, the space has to be filled. But part of me would have been fine if we just like sat for the next hour, and that would be what was on YouTube, because a lot of wisdom we could gain from that too. But my name is Kazu. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm currently in a small coastal village of Huchin, now better known as Oakland, the traditional land of the Ohlone people. And really, really humbled and honored to be here. I'm part of a morning practice group, and I was sharing with the folks this morning. I'm like, I think they called the wrong person. I don't think they meant to have me on this call. So really honored to be here. I'm also from Japan. I'm of the Yamato Japanese people, which are the colonizer settler people that Tara had talked about. So I come from colonizer people myself, and grew up mostly in Massachusetts, and have been here for about 16 years. And, you know, when I think about lineage, I've been thinking a lot recently about a concept that originates from the religion, the spiritual teachings of Jainism, called Anekantavada, which speaks of multiple truths. That there's like no one has a monopoly on truth. That truth with a capital T is made up of countless multiple truths coming together. And I really feel that, because I feel like I come from many different lineages. I was born into a Shinto household. I moved to the States, and I had a Native American stepfather for a while. So we spent summers on the res, and we had a sweat lodge in the backyard. And then when I was 17 years old, I was in a pretty broken place in my young life. I had dropped out of high school when I was 15 and was not in a really good place. And I met a group of Japanese Buddhist monastics called Nippon Zammyo Hoji, and they're a group of Buddhists that are really committed to nonviolence and social change work. And so when I was 17, I ended up going on a walk. These Buddhists were organizing a walking pilgrimage from Massachusetts down the coast of New Orleans and then eventually down the coast of Africa to retrace the slave route and to initiate a process of healing and reconciliation from that legacy, with an understanding that, you know, we're not going to be able to resolve any issues of racism today if we don't go all the way back and heal the legacies of the enslavement of African peoples and the genocide of indigenous peoples. And so on a whim, I was bored. I told my family I'd check it out for a week, and I left home for a year and a half. I ended up spending a year overseas, studying in their monasteries throughout Asia. And so a lot of the work that I do starts there, from a Buddhist practice that's really committed to nonviolence. And then over the years, I came home from that year and a half and got involved in a lot of nonviolent direct action movements, the anti-globalization movement in the late 1990s and Occupy and all these things. But then over the last 5 or 6 years, have found myself doing a lot of restorative justice and trauma healing work, mostly in the prisons, because I saw that, you know, oftentimes so-called nonviolent movements will use nonviolent power to leverage power and then shove that power down the throats of the other side. And I found that, yeah, there was something missing in that. And so I've been on an exploration around trauma healing, and now coming back to a place of trying to figure out what it could look like for all of those worlds: my spiritual practice, my direct action practice, my restorative justice and trauma healing practice, to come together. And one of the big questions that I've been exploring recently is, if we were to view nonviolent direct action as a modality of collective trauma healing, what could it look like? So that's a little bit of the legacy that I'm trying to understand for myself in this moment. So I'll pause there for now, but honored to be here. So.
I'm certainly comfortable with long silences. And I think that the ponderer that also spent a lot of times in spaces with people. And I think this relates to the question of, you know, of belonging. I'm deeply introverted. I have a public life, but I'm deeply introverted. And so even like, you know, processing questions like that tend to take a longer time. And I've spent a very long journey in my life of being in spaces of community, progressive community, where that gets, I'll just say, feedback. So my lineage of belonging is primarily out of a sense of not belonging, I think is the most true thing I can say. Lots of different, perhaps intersections in my own family, intersections in where I was situated and growing up in terms of race, sort of I'm not biracial, but I have mixed heritage. My heritage, and my mother is very fair. My father's dark. So I sort of sat in the middle of my family at this sort of strange intersection of not looking like, you know, quite anyone, and, you know, result of all many different things. Didn't quite fit in with the Black folks. You know, definitely wasn't white. In fact, I had my junior high school years as about 95% ethnic Chinese. It was much more comfortable with Chinese folks, and so I've I think in my, you know, I could go on and on, but many different iterations of being somehow at some intersection that doesn't quite fully fit in someplace else, and I think it's also somewhat of my you know, and this is one of those things about semantics, like, you know, how much of that is, you know, bred internally and how much of that is a result of the experiences that I've had. For me, I've taken that as a way of understanding myself as part of everything. And that's also relating to also my, I guess, my Buddhist practice, and particularly the Taoist influence of my Buddhist practice, and particularly Zen. So Zen is sort of distinct in its strong stream of Taoism that runs through it. And, you know, and so of course, interesting point of belonging to be, you know, Black and queer, female, and, you know, in Zen in America, which is, you know, mostly white and male, and, you know, all sorts of other things. And so I have managed also to sort of choose spaces out of, you know, perhaps reincarnation and feeling myself of a different time space thing, landed in this body, and then trying to navigate belonging inside of that. Once I ran into a quote some years ago, and it was speaking about the notion of being atopos, and atopos meant that one was out of place, meaning out, and topos is meaning place. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it. I'm an autoposian. I am out of placean. That's my thing. But the idea, and it was Socrates that said that all philosophers should be atopos. They should all be out of place, because in order to belong, one has to give up something of the truth. And so I've come to understand that part of my sense of not belonging is not a negative thing in the sense of like, oh, I feel I don't belong, but rather I don't want to give up whatever it is that feels like it needs to be given up in order to belong to, you know, particular groups. So like you have to give up some seeing, you have to like something that you notice or you know to be true. And that has very much been a part of my discourse or theory of, you know, theory of like the unfolding of race in particular in this country, is that belonging has been the wedge by which peoples have been forced apart and been, I like to say, seduced, induced, or reduced by the structures of white supremacy and slavery and enslavement of people. That belonging is something so fundamental to us, and I feel that deeply in my body, the sense of need for belonging, but has been it was made into a weapon, really. And so it's deeply part of my way of looking at the world and understanding, and you know, similar to what Tada said, like I have come to understand that we can't, that, you know, race and many of the forms of annihilation that we feel as a course of, you know, belonging in the wedge between, you know, belonging and not belonging are somatic experiences. They are things that happen to and on our bodies, and not just in culture and in belief. And so belonging is kind of the language of my, it's my love language. It's the way that I relate, and it is my lineage, because out of that, out of placeness, I feel I can find belonging for myself in all sorts of places and locations, and try to communicate that essential belonging to other people as the core of my work.
Thank you.
It's so nice to hear from you all. I feel like I could just do this all morning. I'm Stacy Haynes, and oh, there's so many entry places here. I am in Oneonta and Miwok territory, Petaluma, California, about an hour north of Oakland. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about lineages, the complexity and cultural appropriation, but I'm also sitting in an Aikido dojo right now, is where I'm hanging out with you all from. There's some Joes behind us and sitting cushions, and a lot of the somatic work that we do with movement folks, some of it happens up here. God, it's so interesting, all of your stories. I think if I was gonna say where I first got connected into like transformation or longing, or what I might call now is path. You know, I grew up in rural Colorado, very, very high in the mountains, about 9,100 feet, in a very white community. My family is about third generation Coloradan, which is a long time for Europeans. come initially out of Scandinavia, Ireland, and then over to what is now the United States. But I grew up around a lot of violence, domestic violence. I was sexually abused as a kid. And there was something about needing to survive and separate from what was happening. And for me, the kind of way that separation worked is I got very connected to land and very connected to spirit. And was like, how do I manage this thing about being human? And I don't know why I knew how to do that. I actually think all of us know how to do that with trauma, where to go find resource. And I really feel like then land and spirit became my teachers. In some ways, it's funny to me that I'm in somatics because it's so much about being embodied in this dynamic incarnate experience. But I think I was very reluctant to incarnate. So I laugh to myself that I do somatics because it's so much about incarnating deeply into the wisdom that actually flows through our bodies and ourselves. And then, you know, in politicization, you know, I think it was really, thankfully, I had some high school teacher had us read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And I really had one of those moments where I was like, wow, if Columbus discovering America is a lie, and that's so foundational, what else is a lie? And I think it kind of hit off the, you know, kind of knocked the dominoes down. And I started getting enough access to understanding what was actually happening in our world, names for what was happening in many of the families around me, including mine. And got much more connected to then a social justice lineage. I got to land in school when third wave feminism was just, and I'm very thankful. I'm always thankful for the core teachers of you know, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Chandra Mohanty, just people who created a framework through which to really understand liberation, understand oppression, understand my complex roles inside of that and what I could do with it. Somatics I really found because I was looking for my own healing. I was like, this is a lot of trauma to navigate, and how am I going to do that? And, you know, I don't know if anyone else, you know, I looked down the road of like, what would being addicted to heroin be? That might soothe a lot of this trauma. And I'm really glad I never actually tried that. I tried a lot of other things, but I didn't try that because I probably would have liked that actually. But you know, healing is a big choice and a big road. And I feel very, very thankful that I chose it, and very thankful that what I found was somatics as a way to do that, which is very, very effective with trauma, personal trauma and systemic trauma. And that really stepped me into the work 25 years ago, and here I remain. I think mostly I've stayed with somatics because I've watched it work in so many contexts with so many people and free things that thinking about it alone would never free. And I think that longing for freedom, for liberation at the individual and collective level is a deep, ongoing draw. I think the last thing I want to say, and it's interesting, Angel, as you talk about belonging. And, you know, in the lineage of somatics that I'm in, we talk a lot about safety, belonging, and dignity as these inherent needs. And our conditions, oppressive conditions, do not give safety, belonging, and dignity to all beings and all people. And so we end up, to me, how I see it is, you know, en masse, in hundreds of thousands of millions of people, we end up embodying either these oppressive dynamics that we learn or our survival strategies to navigate them. And, you know, we need different conditions. We need conditions that let us embody interdependence and cooperation, and that we're a small part of the life on this planet. So maybe that leads us into some of the other complex conversations we're going to have about the connection between personal and systemic transformation. But I will pause there. I'm really happy and honored to be in conversation with you all today.
Thank you. And we're about a third of the way through our time. So I want to just invite a quick little break to check back in with your body, catch back up with your body. For those who are watching as well, maybe just notice where your breath is and attend to any body needs you have. And I'd love to get a sense. These next questions, I won't necessarily wait for everybody to have a response to each of them. So we'll be weaving in a couple questions at a time, and you can just respond to the ones that really grab you. I don't want to assume that we all have a common understanding of what societal healing means. So I'm curious, and I imagine there are folks who would say, kind of building on what some of you have already said, that we live in a system and a society where fitting in and this pseudo-belonging has been weaponized, and that there is no, it's not a time for healing when there is no belonging, because there's no, like complete disparity in resources, disparity in power, and it's actually a time to fight for justice and equity. So how would you respond to that, and how would you, through that, help us understand what societal healing means to you?
I'll say something. So I think that where I sit at in terms of this conversation is the nexus of both naming the ways in which, similar to what Stacy said, that society doesn't create the conditions for, safety, dignity, belonging, and so naming those things, right, and naming kind of the process by which that happens as a means for people to uncover it. And simultaneously, I think, quite particularly through what we say is somatic, or I would say, I call it embodiment work. And as a result of, my own, practice, spiritual practice, and also have a martial arts background and so on, positing that there's some essential way that we can develop our own inherent sense of dignity, safety, and belonging. And that that societal healing for me is the merging or the dance between those two of saying that we can't actually wait until those things are healed. We can't wait until those systems acquiesce. We can't wait until, the so-called structural powers that be yield in order to discover those things for ourselves, and so that we have to not, in fact, quite in response to the fact of how unwell, society is and unwell culture is in those regards. We actually therefore have a greater responsibility to do that work. And I've come to start using the word labor instead of work, to do that labor for and in ourselves. Both simultaneously and on behalf of society, but also, distinctly and individually and in and of ourselves. That is because we are of society. And I think a lot of our discourse in the kind of progressive space teeters between this sense of like it's an either or conversation rather than a with and through conversation, like it's with and through, not even just both and, but with and through, that it happens through us and with us. And societal healing comes about as a result of our own claiming of our healing. And to divorce ourselves, to figure out how we divorce ourselves, or people will say decolonize ourselves from the notion that our access to power exists solely in the material realm. I think that is a fundamental flaw in a lot of the discourse we have in movements for justice, is that we rest them in the realm of the material, as if the material is the only value. And I think that that's a capitalist function that diminishes all of our imagination and our sense of how we value ourselves. So we're even valuing ourselves by something that is inherited and kind of outside and beyond the truth that my core system of valuation is not by material. Even the basic materials of, you know, needing home and so on, my core sense of, so I argue for, if you will, push towards, cajole for people to locate their, however they want to name it, right? Their spirit, the fact of their breath, as the core measure of their sense of value in the world. And from there, we have a very different lens on material matters and power and all of those other things.
Yeah. Oh, Kazu?
Go ahead.
Sure. If I may add also, like, there's like a picture maybe for folks who are following. This is something I was working on yesterday. Like, you know, when our jaw hurts, or when we have a headache, let's say, then we might have a jaw pain, right? And then underneath that jaw pain, right? So if you go to a Western doctor, or so-called, or white allopathic doctor, whatever you want to call it, they'll think your migraine or intestinal conditions are separate from each other. But when you actually track, your migraine connects to your jaw pain, connects to your shoulder pain, and then your liver is underneath your right shoulder, inflamed, right? You know, has too many toxins in it. But then you underneath that, you might have gut dysbiosis. And then, you know, more we track pain, we get closer to center. And then when we get close to center, into the intestines, so into dantian or hara area, right, in the center of our gravity, and then we find out, oh, this is about my family trauma. And then you realize your family trauma is about your cultural trauma. And then you realize your cultural trauma is about your ancestral trauma. And then, you know, this is kind of like the cultural somatic perspective I work with, is you see that, like, oh, like this inside body thing is also inside of another body suffering. And I think this is, you know, like the you know, what Reverend Angel spoke to, that we cannot wait, is because, I mean, all these mechanisms of healing and suffering are interconnected with each other at all times. And I think there's something about yeah, really going back to that and starting with that sense of wholeness, you know. And so you know, in my own work, we saw that, like, and this also happens with things like white supremacy. When we're talking about white supremacy, they're like, oh, this is like, or like there's like an outbreak of something, of white supremacy, you might call it, like at Charlottesville, let's say, you know, there's an outbreak of white supremacy and hyperinflammation response. But then when you track it, you start doing this, and this, and you find out, like, oh, white folks have this deep attachment pain to their culture. You know, you start getting into the roots of European history, and then the imperialism that started with, you know, that's been there for many, many centuries, right? And the violence that's been going on and accumulated in the people. And you see what that's done to the actual bodies of, you know, white folks and their microbiome, and, you know, how they essentially launched the colonial project to secure stimulants like sugar and caffeine. Right? This is, the colonial project was driven by the nervous system needs of people who were imperialized for centuries. So yeah, I just wanted to share that, a little bit of that kind of breath of how I feel. Like there's the whole point of cannot waitness is also that same cannot waitness around, like, you know, let's say when a person with a fair amount of privilege, like a white middle class person, let's assume they're a cis dude, and they walk into a doctor's office, I have this chronic pain, but the doctor never asks them about, oh, so what are your ancestors doing? And this is a question that people of color face all the time, is that our health and well-being is, you know, immediately assumed to be connected to, or I mean, hopefully connected to where we've come from in our stories. And that's not the same for everybody, but I don't know. That's kind of like the origin of my work, but I just wanted to, you know, offer a little bit of that. What is that cannot waitness? Is, of course, like somebody, a person you might say is not affected by colonization, just sitting there in an empty bubble, suffering maybe from diabetes, and like not realizing that's actually like hundreds of years old impact of imperialization in the body, and that what's done that through time, and how that's scaffolded in our entire cultural system, like including our posture, including how we breathe, how we walk through the world, our clothes, our work schedule, our diet. It's like we're swimming in it, you know. So I think there's the yang, I cannot wait, and then there's the yin quality of I cannot wait, which is like, oh damn, like I'm in here all the time. Like my alarm clock, you know, is a part of my trauma. You know what I mean? I set my alarm clock today because it's way early for me, but you know, like, but yeah, just wanted to offer a bit of that picture, I guess, for folks.
Thanks for that, Tara.
Mhm.
And Kazu, if I'm going to offer another thread, and if you wanted to go in a different direction, please feel free to continue to bring that in. I think we're starting to talk about this intersection between individual and societal healing, and I'm really curious to hear how folks see those two relating. And I also really encourage you to, for the folks watching, to offer an experience that maybe they can touch in some way, whether that's like a story or a felt experience, so that we're concrete and not only in the realm of ideas.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the need to fight for justice and the need to heal, societal healing, personal healing, to me, those things shouldn't be mutually exclusive, right? Even though they sometimes feels like it happens in that way. And there's a way in which, like, if someone is actively beating me, it's hard for me to work on my own personal healing in that exact moment. And on a social level, in a way, that is what's happening. There are communities that are actively being targeted, and Earth is being actively beaten. And so I do think there is that need for more escalated responses to that. And to me, in my work, that looks like nonviolent direct action. But like I said, that we have, I work a lot in prison, and we have teams of nonviolence trainers in several different prisons throughout the state. And one of our trainers, Bilgi, who's currently incarcerated in Soledad prison, he said once that resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. And when we're working on social healing and we're using nonviolent direct action with our only intention being like, we need to pass this piece of legislation or we need to change this structure, we're not actually working on the healing of relationships. And if at some point we don't get to a place where we're healing relationships, then there's always going to be new conflict. There's always going to be someone who doesn't belong. And if anyone is feeling like they don't belong, then there's always going to be separation, and there's always going to be the roots of violence. And so I think as we work on social healing, because I think a lot of times people who do social change work and nonviolent direct action work see their work as like within that ecosystem of change, like they're working on structural healing. But if we're not working on the tending of relationships, then there's always going to be conflict. And I found in my own self that if I'm operating from a place of unhealed trauma, then I'm not going to be in a place where I can facilitate healing of relationships with other people. Especially when we're dealing with social healing and all of the systemic forms of violence. Like, it's so escalated that when we enter into escalated spaces, if we have unhealed trauma, chances are it's going to get triggered very easily. And, you know, I see that happening a lot in activist spaces where, you know, one of the signs of trauma is that like everything becomes black and white. And we live in an extremely polarized, like everything is black and white. You're either with us or you're against us. And I'm seeing that happen a lot. And I think that's a manifestation of collective trauma. And so if we're not all doing our own work of healing through our own traumas, then we're gonna bring that into movement spaces. And I also just want to say that, you know, sometimes it's overwhelming to think about like, how do we fix the world and all of these big systems? And I found that for myself, the more I'm able to heal through my own traumas, and the more that I am able to live into a real sense of belonging and a real sense of community, the less I need to rely on the systems out there to feel like I belong, right? And the less we rely on the systems out there, the less we actually even need to change all of the stuff that's going on out there, because the things that we're working on is building a sense of belonging in here. And so I think there's this, like, it almost feels contradictory, because on the one hand, I'm saying we need to fight these systems and we need to create systemic change. And at the same time, the more we're healed, the less we need to rely on everything that's going on out there in the first place. So maybe we actually don't need to do as much of these, like, we need to change the world as we sometimes think.
I think about this a lot. I'll probably think about it for the rest of my life, about what are these interdependencies between personal and systemic transformation is how I think about it. And and then I do have a concrete example, but from a somatic lens or the embodied lens, it's like we embody the social and economic conditions in which we're swimming. We can't not. We can't not. It's what's shaping us. It's what's teaching us practices until we go about learning other practices on purpose and transforming ourselves. So when I look at social movements, of course, we're leading from whatever state of healing or embodiment we're in. I don't know if that's very clearly said, but it's like, mostly when I look at social justice movements or climate justice movements, it's like, how can we be the most healed, most transformative organizers, leaders possible? I really believe that the more we do our internal work, the clearer the visions of possibility are, the less polarization we'll end up in, the less implosion. And it doesn't mean we won't do those things. We have conflict. We're humans. We're going to have conflict. But how we be and show up inside of that conflict, how we can use that as a transformative force. And then how do we, I know we're talking about resource distribution when we're talking about justice, right? It's one thing we're talking about is like, can we have equal access to resources, safety, belonging, and dignity? Can we actually construct that social and economic reality? I don't know, we will see, right? We're under some time pressure with the climate right now. But I think why I see healing and social justice work as co-serving is it feels like if we don't do our healing, we will just automatically reenact whatever conditions we're hurt by and shaped by or privileged by. And if we don't then organize ourselves to move toward more equity, more a collective structure of interdependence, then to me, we just keep recreating trauma. I mean, partly why I could never just be like a coach, a trauma therapist, something like that, is I couldn't do tertiary prevention my whole life. I can't just keep helping individuals because the system is big and churning and just keeps generating so much pain and so much trauma. But one of the things that also feels important in this, and then I will give that example, is there are so many transformative processes happening and being sold in the US right now that have no social analysis in them. And that fundamentally, at the end of the day, support racial capitalism. At the end of the day, it's like, we're going to use this mindfulness practice to sustain and to be calmer in our corporate setting and never question the profit motive at the bottom of that structure. I feel really worried about that. Like, I'm just like, wait, flag. That is not what we want to use this for. We actually want to use this for liberation. And that is not liberation. That is managing, surviving within a traumatizing context, an oppressive context a little bit better and feeling a little bit less stressed out about it. That is, to me, not the goal of what we're all doing here. On a story at GS, Generative Somatics, we got to partner with the National Domestic Workers Alliance for a number of years in their leadership development program. So these are domestic worker leaders. Majority are immigrant, poor, women of color at this stage in US history. And we got to do 20 days of development together. So somatic development, trauma healing, organizing skills, strategy work. And one of the things that was a theme, there's themes to embodiment within groups. So this is not everyone, but one of the things we noticed collectively as a theme is under increased pressure, the embodied trauma response was to appease. And we go, of course it is. Look at the conditions, the training from the social conditions for these particular domestic worker leaders. And again, that wasn't every individual, but that was the default. And really what we got to look at is how has that survival strategy, that automatic somatic response served survival, served adaptation, and how does it not serve empowerment, social change, organizing, and liberation, right? And through the embodied healing process, how do we open up more options? So I see that across different sectors. Often what we have embodied doesn't serve the end game of what we're up for, which is another reason to keep, right, changing ourselves.
I'd love to add a couple more threads here. I'm curious, for those who are listening, who if there's something you can offer in terms of a concrete question that people can ask themselves to check, like, am I so focused on systemic change that I'm missing trauma that I'm bringing into it? Or am I so focused on healing myself that I'm missing the role that I'm playing in perpetuating oppression? What are some ways that people can check themselves? That's like kind of a good enough question on its own, but I want to also bring in something that I'm seeing is happening in the live stream around curiosity around how much a change of systems can change the quality of our relationships and be healing of trauma in itself.
I think I wanted to say that this is, quite specific to this moment in time. Right now, we're running almost in the middle of what's called the Great Radical Race Read. And we planned something along its lines before the uprisings and, morphed it to, really meet people where they are. So there's a bunch of people that are reading, but the reading is not really the important thing. Actually, what's the important thing is we're walking through, a variety of somatic and, like a framework of liberation, because, to Stacey's point, it's like, if we're not, we can read, we're like, go read a book. That's what we tell folks. We're like, oh, white people, you don't know, go read a book. Okay, you're going to just read it with the shaping that you have, right? And it's going to be this sort of intellectual, objectified distance, so on. Okay, so how do we work with that? So have people like, do things more together, but, you can kind of go on, and without a real framework for people being able to shift the how. It's not the what, it's the how. I think, Stacey and I share the towards what end, right? And so towards what end? So in this particular moment, one of the things that's really present for me, we're like 401 years into our understanding of the advent of enslavement of African peoples here, to not understand in this country in the same ways that we understand we do not land acknowledgement, and to kind of allow ourselves to steep into the truth of like that we're on people's lands that were stolen from this, even those of us that were brought here on, not at our own will, that we're on these people's lands, and at great, at cost to their lives, to not understand that this country was built on that, and also in the cauldron of practices and patterns and protocols of enslavement and of maintaining the enslavement of peoples for the purposes, and white supremacy is that, right, is for the purposes of maintaining power, control, domination, and capital resources. If we and like with all the embodiment work, one of the things I'm really like clear about, it's like, even outside of this context, it may be something different questions. But I think to bring people deeper into, in this moment, if we really want to kind of put our finger in the dike of the most kind of like it woven through the entire fabric of this society issue, right? Which is racialization. In our embodiment questions, whatever, right, like whatever the embodiment questions, if we don't also understand how this maps to maintaining capitalist racialization, right? Literally patterns of enslavement, like how people relate to Black bodies are proprietary relationships, the overarching relationships that whiteness, white culture, and by extension, the ways in which other brown, Black, Asian folks are drawn into whiteness, is that it is a relationship of ownership of the Black body that gets maintained, right? The policing of Black bodies is about the ownership of Black bodies. We police Black bodies because they need to be owned. I could go on and say, really, the policing is actually about white people, right? We're actually trying to police white people so that we can maintain a social order that allows a small few to stay up there. But if we can see the ways that in our own, like, is this, so here's a question. How are these behaviors actually maintaining not just some random set of forms of dominance, but how is it actually maintaining anti-Blackness, upholding and keeping in place white supremacist values, protocols, etc., through very specific patterns that have been practiced for hundreds of years in the form of enslavement of peoples, right? And in the form of disappearance of indigenous peoples. This is our lineage collectively in this country. And we are steeped and stewed in it in such a way that even people that are fairly recently migrated to this country get induced into participating in these protocols. And we understand them and look at them sort of divorced from their historicity, and that is a mistake. As long as we're not understanding not just that these patterns exist, but they have a purpose. They're not just like, oh, they're out there and we do these things. And whiteness has a purpose. It is not just whiteness for whiteness' sake. But if we don't understand the purpose, then we can't reclaim our own sense of agency and truth and recognition of how we are complicit in these systems, because it divorces even our own patterns and participation in collective behaviors from the historic collective construct, right? It's like, it's not just collective and social, it is for a reason. And without understanding the reason, we're left to pick and choose which of the things we think are workable for us and not workable for us. And I think that we've missed out on that for too long, and really want to invite people to say, essentially, how are the things that you're participating, the behaviors that you choose, the things that you take up, your practices, part of maintaining anti-Blackness and white supremacy, specifically in this time and place?
So, thank you, Reverend Angel. And if I may, I might slide in from the side. I guess, and I've taken one Aikido class, or maybe two, but I guess that'd be Irimi and Tenkan. Or I don't know if it's Irimi, but sidestepping and then reverse is, so coming in from the side here a little bit. To speak a little bit about what I work with, referred to often as animism. So this is something that was introduced to me by a dear colleague, Dare Sohei. And of course, like, animism is a big part of all, indigenous cultures with, medicine doctors, shamans, those kind of, witchy folks. But yeah, this idea that all things are being and all beings are interrelated. And, of course, this is foundational to, Buddhism, Christianity, when you dig deeper into, any faith, you look at it deeper, that kind of feeling exists. And when I speak about that, I want to go back to actually a little bit what Stacey was talking about, like these meditation retreats happening in corporations and these kind of settings, right? And something that I've been trying to sit with is, with the frustration of that, as me as a Japanese person, I definitely frustrated in general with the entire healing industrial complex with my ancestral lineages, right? Of, Aikido, Zen to Judo, which is all kinds of energy medicines, and so which are very foundational to what we call Western somatic practice now. I think the bulk of it is actually from what we now call Asia. That's really like the foundation, right? So what we call, and if we include yoga into that, that's even more expansive. But what I've been finding within that is the frustration of me as a person who's marginalized, culturally and, racially, and going like, this frustration, and then stepping one step outside of that. And then really trying to understand that the actual practices themselves are their own beings with their own intentions, and stepping into that kind of mythopoetic time space and seeing that like, that they have their own life. And, even like, for example, when I was watching things like Me Too happen, I was like, oh, how much of Asian culture is in this that's unspoken? How much of yoga, how much of mindfulness, what are the practices that allowed people after all these years to feel that embodied bravery and safety to actually speak in this moment collectively, if that makes sense? And I don't think that's spoken, but I'm like, oh, this is definitely, there's a timeline that we're on. When let's say, I think Zen came to the States, I think in the 1950s, in the post-war period, from a country they just bombed. Like, what are the ancestors doing? What are the strings that are being pulled? What is, I'm a street dancer, so I think about what is, Black music that came out, especially for me, out of Oakland and LA, like up and down the working class, Black communities of the West Coast, that, folks who worked in factories, and that's where the kind of dance comes from. Like, what is the message of that going out into the world en masse? Like, and how is it changing bodies and nervous systems? And of course, a lot of the channels that my dance, that I do went out into the world, like films like Breaking, it's like Hollywood films. There's an ambivalence there, because in the very which ways these things spread, to me, there was capitalism, there's racism, all the isms are involved, yet the actual form of the dance still held something within it that was liberating, if that makes sense. And it's like there's a and or, a both and thing happening all the time within transmission of these things. So I just wanted to come in from the side a little bit to say, like, I think there's also, because there's a mention of how are these practices changing us, who we are today, how are we moving towards liberation, and I think there might be some piece of like listening to the actual practices themselves and what they are doing, because when we start to see what the practices are doing, you see a whole other, like, when you see that they have their own agency, it doesn't mean that we abuse their agency, of course, right? But I think I find it to be a very interesting time, because I know from my own self that I would be afraid, as much as there's cultural appropriation in yogic practice, I'd be afraid to talk to a white person about race if they haven't done any somatic practice, any sense of nervous system regulation. Like, at least there's some beginning of touching it. And I think this is like a really very fruitful time in regards to that. And, this includes all cultures of color, basically. We were talking about, Afro-diasporic dance and music to, Asian somatic practices to indigenous like ritual practices. They've been proliferating, and they've been proliferating within like this white capitalist corporate world, actually. But we see also right now, this is pivoting time where a lot of those folks are being like routed and pivoted into, so I think there's a part of me that tries to hold like a really long view, a mythopoetic view of like, this moment is very frustrating, but I can also see my ancestors and other people's ancestors doing the work, if that makes sense. They're like, oh yeah, I know this looks like shit and feels really bad. And I get really frustrated when I see these like white women yoga retreats on Facebook and they're like, you know, $2,000 and they're 3 days in Bali or whatever. Like it's really frustrating. And then there's the other part of me. I know that I know that one day Elizabeth Gilbert will come and play, maybe their descendants. There's a piece of that. So I just wanted to, and I think there's something about, yeah, the yin quality of cannot wait, you know, and the yang quality of cannot wait both seem to be able to come together when we're able to hold those realities together and seeing like, oh, this is happening. And how do I allow the thing that is happening to be even more alive, if that makes sense. So just wanted to, I don't know if that was a proper Iimi and Tenkan, but I tried.
Thank you. And I'm unbelievably well, I have 15 minutes left, and I'm having a really hard time asking just one question at a time. So I'm going to once again bring in a couple, because this what Rev and Tada just said is bringing up for me a couple of things. One is around just the deep history that we have in this country of theft and appropriated ownership of not just Black bodies, but also of stolen land. What I'm curious about how, and how you mentioned this, like that embodied practices help people sort of be able to sink into that pain a little bit and work with it and sort of flex and bring forth. I'm going to stop trying to articulate what I'm just trying to say. I think you all get what I'm trying to say. And the other piece that I'm interested in too is that all of you actually bring in some lineage that came from Japan, whether that's Aikido or Zen or ancestry, Japanese somatics. And I think all of you also bring in some learnings from African-American activism and culture, right? Tada, you mentioned straight dancing. I think, Stacey, you mentioned Audre Lorde and bell hooks. And, you know, I find this all, like this blend, really fascinating in the context of where we are in conversation around cultural appropriation, which comes from that mix of both wanting to bring healing forth and share that healing so that we can all heal, and also acknowledging how much erasure and othering has been in our history. So how can people sit with that? How do you sit with that? And what advice do you have for people who do bring in healing lineages other than their own?
You have 5 more hours?
I know. In 3 minutes.
Can I jump back in two minutes, because it's a question I field so much as especially and I'll just shut up for the rest of the call really quickly after. But I think if you're taking on a person's, you become adopted into the culture. I consider myself adopted into, I'm not Black, but I'm responsible for my siblings. Does that make sense? It's very ancestral. Like I have now like ancestors of vocation as a dancer who came from these like, impoverished communities, and the gifts of healing is what I'm able to transmit. So I just have this natural responsibility. And I think there's a sense of like siblinghood. I think that's very important. And so like if you're from a broken home and you got adopted into a family that has a semblance of wellness and nourishment, how would you treat your family? I think it's actually quite that simple. It's not necessarily about treating culture as property. It's treating culture as a kind of like an emergent phenomenon that happens out of participation. I think that's like the real issue. So there's just something about, like if you practice within a Japanese lineage, it's just appropriate to learn about the people that, the culture is, is stewarded by and comes from as sibling, and have that responsibility, not necessarily to an individual Asian person or individual Black person necessarily, but even to like the spirit of that practice itself that is held as a kind of like this embodiment. Like in Black music, you have, you might, or dance, you might have improvisation and structure and rhythm and these qualities that are like as a dancer, I supposedly I trained for like 10 years, but I know that often when I see common, what we call lay folk, Black folks dancing at a barbecue, and I'm hanging out with them and they're just doing this with each other, I'm just like, okay, like that 10 years of me, I have to be humble with that. There's this emergent lay practice in every culture that a lot of what the specialist kind of practices evolve around. And I think that's the same everywhere. And I think it's very, very important for us when we're stepping in to understand the difference. And that's like one place where we can start. And then also from there comes like, yeah, we are in like a sibling partnership now. And it's not necessarily about property. If you're not going to steal like this, the silver spoon from the house and sell it at the market now, if you're given a place to rest. And I think that there's something about that that's like a very important quality to me. So I just wanted to, and I feel this question a lot. So I just wanted to jump in really quickly. And it's just.
I think I want to follow the threads and loop around and talk about whiteness and anti-Black racism and shaping of white supremacy. I think, Angel, some of the things you threw out are very, very powerful and very evocative, and are like, oh, that's good to basically practice with and think about for another decade. But something that I've been, in this round of uprisings, this round of racial justice work and movement in the U.S., I've been really going, what is up with white people? What is up with how we are shaped, and what the deep holding on is, the deep holding on. And because it happens across class with white people in such a particular way, it isn't just about access to resource. It isn't, right? Now, we might see in the big picture, it's about this myth that you can become that wealthy white man, whoever, right? Our myth of who our God is, right? Who our social God is. But I've really been looking at it through this deep shaping and trauma lens. And I think we have embodied and inherited this profound misperception that as white people, our safety, belonging, and dignity is dependent upon racial domination. And that there's a profound identity challenge when it really comes to joining the circle instead of owning and dominating the circle of humanity, like really joining. And I am sorry, I can't remember his name, but I was listening to him, African-American scholar, the other day, and he was talking about, that there's a resource question and then there's the ontological question, the identity question. And I do think that there is for let's say white folks in the US, because that's just where I am, this facing of identity. Who are we, if not, right? This location of domination that we've inherited, and I think it's profoundly somatized. I think it's a somatized identity that has to be transformed, uprooted, and found. It's like finding a new home in a profound way. And I've been doing in these last months a lot of work with, white folks organizing white folks, with Surge and with Catalyst. And just going, what are the deep conversations? What is the deep transformation needed to, in some ways, to do our part profoundly, right, at this moment? But it's the best I can articulate at the moment, but there's a very deep redefinition, reperception of safety, belonging, and dignity that is not based on disappearing of Indigenous people, on what you said, Angel, domination and ownership, right, of Black folks, and all the other dominations, and really separation from the earth. That is also how we've been, like separation from the planet, dominion over. So to be continued, but I just am in really deep reflection about whiteness and the shaping of whiteness. And then briefly to your earlier question, Bo, what are the questions? I think my questions for people, and I get so pragmatic sometimes, but really, like, what are you practicing daily? What is your daily practice? And for what purpose? Like, what's the for sake of what, or what's the transformative intent inside that practice? And then how and where are you spending your time inside of collective action for liberation? And I really go, what are we practicing, and how and where are we spending our time for collective liberation? I think those are Maybe there are two questions that I'm spending a lot of time in right now, but those would be two questions I'd offer.
Thank you.
I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'll try to share a quick story that hopefully touches on several threads. About 10 years ago, I was at a healing and transformative retreat where I talked about something I'd experienced in childhood for the first time in my life. And at that point in my life, because this was something that I experienced like 20 years prior, the story that I was telling myself is, oh, I'm over it. Like, I've healed from it. This happened a long time ago. And then I started speaking about it and I completely broke down. And I realized in that moment how much shame I had wrapped up in this experience from 20 years ago. And from that moment, it took about 10 years of really hard work to get to a place where I can have that conversation with my family. Because for those 10 years, I knew that that's the thing that I needed to do for my own healing. And I was scared shitless. I was scared out of my mind. Because shame is like, it sucks to talk about shame. There's a beautiful quote that I believe comes from Brene Brown, who says that shame derives its power from being unspeakable. And when we don't speak to our shame, it ends up controlling our lives and causing harm in all of these ways. And I share that story because I think part of what we need to do in societal healing is create space for this country to speak to the things that it holds shame around. Like, when we think about the legacy of enslavement of African peoples and the genocide of indigenous peoples, and even things that are going on today, what's going on the US-Mexico border, what's going on in the prisons, all of these things, we should have shame around. And we need to somehow create the courage and the container that feels safe enough for us to really go into that discussion. And it's a really, really scary thing, right? So how do we create spaces, containers where this nation can really speak to the things that it's, and this isn't about shaming people, right? Like, Brene Brown was also on a podcast recently, I forgot which one, I think it was the On Being, where she was talking about how we can't weaponize shame. And so there's a difference between like shaming people and creating space for people to cultivate their own sense of moral shame around all of these issues, right? And I oftentimes think about how, like, you can't hold people accountable because accountability isn't something you can shove down someone's throat. You can only hold space for people to cultivate their own sense of accountability. So when we think about holding people accountable, like, what if the key word there isn't accountability, but to hold? Like, what does it mean to hold space for people to go deep into the conversations about shame? And so I think as we think about how we create containers, how we facilitate dialogues throughout society around the things that it has shame around, the question that I oftentimes ask myself, and I would invite others, is like, what are the things that we least want to talk about? And what are the steps that we're taking so that we can actually begin to have that conversation? Because I think the more we do that for ourselves, the more we can support society in doing that. And there was another question around like healing as a noun and a verb. Like, I noticed that like once I was finally able to have that conversation with my family, I looked up and there was like, oh my God, now I got to have this conversation with this person. And it's like when you're climbing a mountain and you think you get to the top and you look up. And so, you know, there's always more, right? There's so much trauma that we all hold and so much shame that we have wrapped up around these experiences. And so I think doing shame work or work around shame is a big part of the work that we all need to be doing individually and collectively as well.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and Rev, I saw you taking yourself off of mute.
Yeah. I'm going to try to loop some things together. You know, I think that there's a core question. So first of all, like, you know, ontology versus epistemology. I think we are always trying to kind of separate them. I think, you know, epistemological approach is often in the sort of realm of whiteness and intellectualism, and an ontological approaches is often in the bodies of, you know, people that are indigenous and think about, you know, kind of like meaning, you know, meaning behind meaning and assumptions of meaning and creation and so on. So I think that that's one of the things that's really key is to recognize that we have to have both. I think that the question for white folk is like by design, whiteness, and I really like to distinguish between white people, which of course whiteness is directed at in very particular ways, right? But whiteness is its own kind of both social, it's a construct. I think of it as a culture that is meant to insidiously maintain white supremacy. Because most people don't sign up and say, "Hey, I'm up for some white supremacy," you know, and so you have to have it's deeply embedded into culture. So by design, by practice, by maintenance, and by fierce policing, most especially and powerfully through shame and silence, this culture is maintained that is mistaken for people's identity, for white-bodied people's identity, and you can see it because people that have like no more similar than Kazu, you and I are no more similar than many white people are from each other, and yet there's this sort of like pattern, the signature of whiteness itself that tells you that there's a design, right? So either that design is divine or that design is constructed. So I doubt that it's divine. The other thing I'd be left with is something along the lines of like, then white folks must be evil. And so since I'm deeply, committed to not believing that that's true, then the overarching design tells you that there is a hand, right? That there is a hand in that design. And so for me, the thing that I've been saying is that it's really important for white folks to understand that they are bound by the hand of whiteness itself, and that their work is, their labor is to be emancipated, which literally means get out of the hand, that they have to get out of the hand of whiteness to even see what is true and not true, that all of their assumptions, it's not just the what you know, that their ontological apprehension is completely limited by the construct and culture of whiteness itself. That it is not even comprehensible for most white people to understand a free Black person when they see them. They can't even conceive of a free Black people. It's disturbing to their own identity to see and experience free Black people. Not because they're bad people in their mind, but because that design has shaped them to be threatened at a physiological level by the expression of liberated Black-bodied, brown-bodied, by extension, everybody that's not white. And so the knee-jerk reaction to control rather than to belong then emerges as a response. So white folks have to understand that they are bound, and that this whole business of doing work for other people is just, kind of at the original question of which one comes first. I think we got to like kind of put that aside, because the shaping of how white folks even approach the notion of collective liberation is so shaped inside of whiteness. That I think it's almost, I love, Tara, you said, it's like, I'm afraid. Yeah, I'm afraid if white folks don't do their labor of getting themselves out of the hand, then I don't know that they can really, truly be committed to collective liberation.
Thank you all so much. I can't believe I've been lucky enough to actually get to have this conversation with you all, and we are at time, so I'm going to pass it over to Brian to close us out.
I feel the same sense of simultaneous gratitude, and it's like a cruel tease. I think each of you are sort of dipping into conversations that are so deep and complex. And, I was smiling over here off screen when Stacey was like, yeah, it'll take a decade to unpack that one. And then Kazu just shared a story where he was like, yeah, it literally did take a decade. So I just, deep gratitude to all of you. A couple of things I've shared in the live chat for folks who are following along out there is Bo has generously offered to help host a space the same time next week. So it'll be a follow-up gathering. Our discussants here are welcome to join. Not sure who will, but benefit from anyone who feels like being part of that conversation. but it's a chance to continue this dialogue in groups and relationship. And I think one of the threads that I sort of picked up throughout here is you can't do this work on your own. It's impossible. And so I think a lot of the folks were deconstructing this notion of our soma as a disembodied self. We are not. We are part of a collective. And so finding people who are doing that work and can support you in your own work, this is a chance to sort of step into that a little bit with folks who are grappling with this stuff, because it's super hard. I've dropped in the chat some of the latest work from folks here. Kazu has a new book out, Healing Resistance. That's just incredible. I encourage folks to pick it up. Stacy has a new book out on the politics of trauma, which is also just unbelievable. One of those books that, well, both of them, you just read slowly, right? Like take a chapter at a time and then sit. Reverend Angel holds a space with Radical Dharma. That's a community of practice for folks who are interested in deep stepping into this a bit more deeply, which is beautiful and generative. And Tada's got the School of Justice, a ritual school around thinking about some of these practices, and a new podcast that he's co-hosting with his partner Dare that is sharing some of these learnings in real time. So I encourage folks to check those out. I encourage folks to come back next week, Building Belonging. So I think I totally screwed up the introduction by having it not live. So folks missed that part, my apologies. But Building Belonging will be hosting more of these conversations. We're committed to trying to create space for these conversations to happen and bring people together in dialogue. We'll be taking most of August off to sort of process this, and then we're back in September and October with conversations around parenting as a site of transformation, reparenting ourselves as a crucial component of that, education, and transformative justice. So invite folks into those and to continue dialogue. And what I propose to do by way of closing is just a quick closing mood check for the folks here in the room, the virtual room we've got. Invite folks online to please do the same. So I would, looking at Stacey as I'm thinking about this, I think the invitation would be, that's the dojo I was in March. Stacey, I bring back fond memories. To share from below your neck some sort of embodied experience of how you're currently leading this conversation. Folks in the live chat, please feel free to do the same. I will start and pass. I'm feeling full, like fed in sort of a deep way, and also restless, like there's more there, and I wanna dive into it. So let me pass to Reverend Angel.
I guess you didn't hear that part where I said that I don't process quickly like that. So I'm gonna pass to Stacy.
Yeah, that was good. I appreciate that. I feel honoring. Tada.
I feel put on the spot. Okay, let's see. I feel belly in my hara. I feel like rumblings in my belly, hara. So like a fizzy water. And then there's something about melting the, I think Reverend Angel talked about the white folks, and like knowing that they're, it's like this, the bound. I think of Descartes realizing he's dissociated. And so there's a melting in my own body of wherever I've picked up that Cartesian soma to be like a little bit of loosening in this kind of diaphragmic area. So yeah, it's kind of like what I'm trying to sit with. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I can follow. Feels like there's this warmth in my belly. Pass to Kazu.
Thank you. The desire for more is manifesting as like a fizziness, like a carbonated feeling in my body, but it's starting to relax a little bit too. Reverend Angel, would you like to go?
Yeah, buzz, you know, kind of like something like a sort of somewhere between a surface buzzing and womp womp in my body. Yeah, womp womp. Yeah, maybe that's want more of your conversation. So thank you so much.
Beautiful. Just to read out for the folks here some of the ones and the things. Welling of tears, deep belly resonance, heart soft and curious, breathless, further yielding toward gravity. Lots of appreciation. Ooh, feel the sunlight melting my impatience. So lots of generous thoughts from the folks out there in the world as well. invite folks in the live stream to stick around for a moment and share with each other. I'm going to stop the stream here. We look forward to seeing many of you next week. I will have a chance on Medium to share some of the reflections from this conversation, invite folks to share what's landing with you. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of directions to go from here, and look forward to exploring them with all of you. So let me end the live stream.